Well, good day. Here we are to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com that we were talking about the whole idea of non-pharmacological psychiatry. And so we talked about in general some of the approaches and thinking about it. And so today we're going to go into more of that, both in terms of what a professional therapist could do and many self-help things that you can do for yourself. There's many out there. In fact, over the last several years there's been a proliferation of all kinds of new gadgets and toys and so forth, as well as ideas on how you can help yourself. And to me, of course, that's the cheapest of all. If you can help yourself, then you don't have to spend all that money for a professional therapist. And I dare say that in most cases you can help yourself if you really are motivated to do so. I know there are a few people who are kind of dependent and are looking for the magic pill or the magic word from someone else, or the magic pass or wave or whatever. But those who really want to dig in and get rid of some of their garbage and move on with their life, they can do it. Now, don't forget to tell other people about our broadcasts. We gradually are growing in number as far as viewers, and we want to get it up to maybe 10 to 20,000 each week, and we can only do that if you tell a lot of other people about it. We gradually have built a list of some people who are interested. The more people we can reach, the better it is. This is actually, I chose this first year to make it highly educational as well as informative, and get out information that I think that patients and prospective patients and people in general who are interested in health would like to know something about. This psychiatry thing ended up being more than I anticipated. I thought probably one session on psychiatry and one session on other alternatives, but it ended up being longer. So today we're going to show you some interesting things. I did, as I had suggested I might before, bring in some toys, and I call them toys, but really they're some very valuable pieces of equipment or devices that can help move you along on your quest for wholeness, wellness, and being rid of a lot of excess baggage that holds you back. Getting back to what we talked about before, of course, we talked about the fact that there's two main schools of therapy and actually concepts of problems. The one big one, of course, was analytical, goes back to Freud and to Carl Jung and his analytical psychology. He referred to himself more as a psychologist than a psychoanalyst, although he did a type of analysis called Jungian analysis, had to do with archetypes and so forth. And however, Jung got into the wholeness of life, period. If you really want an education and an exploration of the psyche from a very, very broad viewpoint, then you probably would enjoy the works of Carl Jung. If you're thinking more of the dynamics of the mind in terms of the id, ego, and superego as proposed by Freud, and the analysis of the unconscious drives and motivations, then you probably might enjoy Freud. Both got into dream interpretation, but in a different way. However, as psychiatry originally started, and as Jungian psychology, analytical psychology, which still today exists the same, neither of those required drugs in the beginning. But as time went on, and I mentioned my own experience when I started in the field, it started out as being psychotherapeutic, and then a small amount of psychoactive drugs, and pretty soon the drugs took over and the psychotherapy went down the drain, so to speak. It was no longer necessary to worry about any of that. You were just going to manage the symptoms anyhow with the drugs, so who cares why you have the problem, or even getting rid of the problem, as long as we can make you kind of functional by drugging your brain. Now, those of you who probably recently have been following the Michael Jackson issue of his death and the doctor who attended him This is an example of how these medications are so powerful that they ultimately can be destructive, and especially when you mix them together, no one knows what the outcome is, because when they research a drug, they research it in isolation. They don't research it in conjunction with other drugs. Now, how they find out eventually what they're going to do is that they have a what's called the post-release trial, meaning up to the time it's released to the public, they have what are called limited human trials, and only a very small group of people are tested on the drug, so they really have no idea what it's going to do when you get it out to a lot of people. So those people who rush to get a new drug first released on the market become a part of the post-release trial, and it's only then when thousands and thousands of people are taking the drug they begin to find out the total ramifications. Now, I think I mentioned before on a heart drug, an antiarrhythmic that has been kept covered up for years, except there was one book written on it, and of course it was never publicized. But anyhow, this one heart drug caused 50,000 people to drop dead after it was released onto the market. Now, the drug company had an indication that there could be a problem with it, but they chose to not bother to tell the FDA about it, to get it released. And once it was released, and the 50,000 people dropped dead, and they'd be sitting, walking, just fall over dead, the drug still was never pulled to the market. It's still in the market now. It's still in the PDR, with only a warning that says excessive mortality has been related to this drug. Excessive, yeah, 50,000 people was about the number of American soldiers that were killed in the whole 10-year Vietnam War, and they did all that in short order with this drug, but because it was kept out of the news, no one was ever alerted about it, and it's still in the market. Now, the interesting thing is that if one person in this country were taking an herb and they had any kind of health problem, and somehow that person had a health problem, got to a doctor, or RD, real doctor, and they said, well, I've been taking this herb, immediately an alert would go up, the FDA would step in, they would pull all the herb off the market because one person maybe had a problem with it. But how many drugs do thousands of people drop dead with, and they never get pulled from the market? Or at the very least, temporarily they might suspend it until they put out a new sheet of indications and warnings, and then it can be back on the market again. So it's just interesting how big of a public international press we get when one herb might have caused one problem with one person, as opposed to a lot of people dropping dead, and it rarely even can get in the news until a lot of lawsuits start hitting, and then maybe something happens, at least for a while. But a lot of the drugs do get re-released, and people don't realize it because they just have to put in a new indication sheet showing a few more warnings, and then it can be back out again. So anyhow, as I say, the Jackson case was illustrative of the fact that medications can still be very dangerous and even deadly. And even in the hands of a trained doctor, they can be, because they don't know. When you mix 3, 4, 5, 6, when I studied pharmacology, they said you don't know what can happen with 2 or 3 drugs mixed, but at least there's probably a 15 to 25% chance that there's going to be some very adverse reaction. And when you mix 5, 6, 8 drugs together, there's no way of telling what can happen, but probably there's going to be about an 80% chance that there's going to be some bad interaction between those drugs. And so when you start giving 15 to 20 drugs, you can bet that there's some type of terrible adverse response going on in the body that you may not know immediately, but down the road could lead to a fatality. And no one's ever going to track it because there's no way of knowing how much that happened because of that mix of drugs. So at any rate, we want to look at other ways that psychiatry could and were at one time working, and a lot of things have developed over the years because there are a few psychiatrists who really want to help people, And those are the ones who have been more creative and looked into a lot more things about what they can do. Even if they stayed with the Freudian analysis, a few people probably get some help from it. I'd say it's been a very costly method, but no more costly than the drugs, but costly because usually an analysis could take 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and maybe uncovering what happened or why it happened maybe will help, but maybe not. It does not always happen that knowing what the problem is really gets rid of the anxiety or the depression or whatever. In other words, the people can say, oh yeah, now I know why it happened, however I'm still depressed. So that didn't solve the problem necessarily. But at least it's analytical, it's non-pharmacological, and you're not creating further damage, because I have known in one of the books I have referenced in the psychiatry portion of this, I mentioned about people who had been permanently disabled from taking psychoactive drugs. And there's a lot of things that happen that can damage the nervous system that are not repairable, at least not very easily, and at least if you don't believe the brain can be repaired anyhow. The people are totally disabled, many from the teens on, because of the psychological or psychoactive drug medications. The Carl Jung's approach, as I said, was a very interesting approach, and he did something quite unique. He used a GSR instrument. Now, I mentioned that back along the way when we talked about biofeedback. A GSR instrument attaches to either the fingers or the palm of the hand or whatever, and what it measures is skin resistance. And that's why the GSR name, galvanic skin response, which means an electrical skin response, basically. And what happens is that when you hook up to this instrument, you get a baseline reading, and you can adjust the instrument to get like a middle needle reading on a meter. And then as your emotions affect you, or you think about emotional things, you see the needle go up and down. And it works very well, and it's very sensitive. And what Carl Jung did is he would hook people up to the GSR, and he is the first that I recall having found out that he used the GSR. Later, L. Ron Hubbard used it and called it an E-meter in the Church of Scientology. I have to get it correct because there's another Science of the Mind church. Anyhow, the Church of Scientology, and he used it as a method to what he called audit the engrams in the brain, which were disturbing recorded thoughts that were creating havoc for people. So anyhow, Carl Jung had developed lists of words that he would read through, and when he read through that, when he hit a word that had an emotional connection, the needle would jump high. So he would know that something related to that word was an issue, and then he could investigate further into the problem. And so I've done some work with well, not only the GSR, but I've tried the E-meter. A patient of mine gave me one that he had, and so I played around with it, and it's just kind of an interesting setup what Hubbard had developed. I believe he was interested actually in deprogramming mind control in this country. He had been in the naval intelligence, learned a lot about what was going on, and when he came out, I think he wanted to set up an organization that could deprogram people, and I suspect that he looked around and felt under a religious umbrella would be the best way to do it. And that's the way it started out. However, I don't have time to go into the whole history of it, but they were infiltrated and a lot of problems happened. And he finally, I think, got out, got on the big ship, the trade wind, stayed out in the ocean for the rest of his life. A lot of the people came out there for some of the special meetings, but I think he realized that he probably opened a can of worms by trying to deprogram people, but did, at the beginning, help a lot of kids get off of drugs, and a lot of people with a lot of emotional things get rid of that out of the subconscious and sometimes the conscious by doing what he called auditing. But anyhow, Carl Jung actually started it, and it works very well. As I said, I've worked with it, and it's a good way of uncovering touchy words that have some emotional connection, which opens a door to explore further. And sometimes once you get into that, the people will recall a lot of things that maybe they had not thought about in a long time, that was kind of stuffed away in their memory. Now usually that's going to be suppressed stuff, which means at some early time in your life you consciously pushed it aside. Not as easy with repressed things, which are things that automatically were repressed because they were so emotional and so traumatic at the time, and usually at a very young age is when it happens, so you're not aware of what it was, and it may not be a memory thing at all, may only be an emotional issue. So that could be a problem. Now, hypnoanalysis is something that's been used by a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists. Jung did not resort to it as much, if at all. Freud did use it, but for some reason he backed away from it. I think probably because it caused him to have too much personal contact with the people, and he preferred to sit off in the background, not be seen, and just allow what was called free association, meaning just let the person talk whatever pops into their mind. And that was kind of one of the bases of psychoanalysis is the free association thing, where you just let your mind drift and said whatever came into it. And so sometimes that was helpful for people, just to allow these things to kind of surface and talk them out and keep on going, and that was very helpful. But the hypnoanalysis was a shortcut, and I mentioned, I believe, at an earlier point of Dr. Kroger, who was a psychiatrist that dealt a lot with World War II veterans who came back with what they called shell shock or war neuroses, that had probably emotional issues when they went into the military, and the shock of all the killing and the maiming and so forth they had to face, or just the stress of it all, caused them to amplify whatever problems they had, and so they came back non-functional. And basically the government hospitals did not know what to do with them, and so finally Dr. Kroger came along with his hypnoanalysis and was able to get a tremendous number of veterans back in operation. They were able to get rid of all this trauma and also all of the background problems that they had to begin with, and it worked very well. Now, hypnosis somehow got a bad name, probably because of stage hypnosis, where they did demonstrations and everybody's afraid their mind's being taken over and they're going to be made to do things against their will, which neither of those are true. But nonetheless, or they felt that it had something to do with the occult and the black arts and all those things. And so a lot of religious groups put a very negative connotation on hypnosis, but of course it's none of that. But it poisoned a lot of people against hypnosis, and still does today. There's still a lot of people that think some of the things I just mentioned. Again, none of it's true, and hypnosis is a rapid way, not a perfect, in the sense that some people, and I have seen this myself, I was trained and certified in clinical hypnosis and hypnoanalysis, and I had a patient who came to me one time who wanted me to do hypnosis to uncover something because she had no memory from age 12 back in her early life. She knew there was something back there that was creating her a lot of current problems, but she could not remember what it was. And so when we put her under hypnosis, she went back by a process called age regression, where you keep taking the person back younger and younger. And when we got to that 12 point, she would just open her eyes and that was it. She would not deal with it. So that meant that today her conscious mind still was not ready to deal with it. And so the lid was not going to be taken off, and so you couldn't force it to happen. Now, anyhow, that is a good non-drug approach, and I've seen it be very successful in a lot of problems. An expensive approach, it doesn't take long. Instead of doing 2 or 3 years of psychotherapy, you might maybe do 2 to 6 sessions with hypnotherapy or hypnoanalysis and move the person tremendously forward. The other biggie interesting thing that developed along the way was the work of author Janoff, or Jonoff, some people pronounced, who was a therapist who thought that a high percentage of problems that people have are related to the trauma of birth. And so he developed a type of therapy that he referred to as primal therapy. And in this type of therapy, one was encouraged by breathing and so forth to go back and, in a sense, re-experience their birth trauma. And some people, by doing that, they would suddenly start screaming, and it got very loud and scary to people around if you didn't know what was happening. So he had to have some pretty soundproof walls in his office to do the work with people, and so it was sometimes referred to as a primal scream. But at any rate, a lot of people then did get, in fact, relief and felt a lot better, and they felt that they had had a traumatic birth experience coming into this world, and that it had remained as a trauma in their psyche and caused them all kinds of health and especially emotional problems. So it became quite popular, and I'm sure that it's still in existence today, but along the way, as I was learning psychology and psychiatry many years ago, this is one that popped up. But it, as I say, was very effective with a pile of people. And there was another type of offshoot of that. You almost always, anytime a therapy method comes along, then there's someone else that comes along and kind of takes off with that idea and moves it a different way. So there was another one called scream therapy that came off of primal therapy. But Janoff, as I say, wrote a book about it. If you look through Amazon, you should be able still to find his original book called Primal Therapy. And as I mentioned, we're going to at some point do a program just on pre- and perinatal influences on health and also on the emotions and psyche, because it is true that a lot of times there are issues that the child at birth is affected by, or even pre-birth, when the mother's carrying the child, because it starts hearing very early and is feeling all kinds of sounds and sensations. And if there's a lot of upheaval and trauma in the mother's life or her health, either way, it can lead to further health problems, whether physical or emotional, for the child. So actually, it's interesting because there is an organization that focuses just on pre- and perinatal birth trauma. So that to me is very good. And then, as we mentioned earlier when we talked about behavior modification, there are some therapists who still do behavior modification. In fact, I'm sure there are a lot that do. Remember, I said that the analytical school says unless you uncover the old reason for the trauma, then you're never going to get well, whereas the behavior modifiers said, I don't care what the old trauma was, let's just change your behavior. And so they have come up with all these different ways of doing it. The two most prevalent were the classical behavior therapists, originally the work of Pavlov, where it was a conditioned reflex, or you could actually associate a new behavior with a present behavior until finally the new behavior was triggered from the same stimulus. So it's a stimulus response type thing. And so that was the one type. And then there were some offshoots of that called aversion therapy, where you actually shock the person every time they thought of the bad emotional problem. You actually put electrodes on them and shock them. And they got, of course, deconditioned because they got tired of being shocked. Wasn't so pleasant. And so that was called aversive therapy or aversion therapy. And then they had the immersion therapy, which I mentioned before, that if the person was afraid of a snake, you just walk in and throw a snake in their lap, and they're either going to get better or they're going to probably flip out, one of the two. But if they lost that, then they got better. So that was a form of behavior modification, that you didn't worry why they were afraid of a snake or a dog or an elevator or whatever it is. You just You know, in the elevator, you just shove them in the elevator, and they either got better or they passed out, one of the two. But that's kind of the extreme. And of course, the other type of therapy was the operant therapy, which came along from Skinner. The other guys were Pavlov and Andrew Salter, conditioned reflex therapy, and Watson, J.B. Watson, who did a lot of behavior modification. But Skinner, B.F. Skinner came along, and he got a little bit more sophisticated. He said, we don't want to do all the punishment, the aversion, and all of the type of things that normally are being done. The best thing to do is just wait for the right behavior that you want, and you reinforce that by rewarding it. And so operant conditioning became very popular. And so it's true, you know, if you have a kid that's doing something that you like, you reward it. And you don't reward other behaviors, and so pretty soon they want to do that behavior more so they can get the reward. Now, the most powerful form, I didn't mention it before, of operant conditioning is something called intermittent reinforcement. That means instead of being rewarded every time, just sometimes. And it was random, so the person or animal or whatever you're conditioning would have no way of knowing when it's going to happen. And so they keep doing it over and over to try to get the reward. And so that's even more powerful form than rewarding every time. Now, a perfect example of that is gambling. You know, when you have people who are compulsive gamblers, do they win every time? No. They just win once in a while. But do they keep going back and losing and losing and losing for the thrill of the win? Yes. And so they can become very hooked. So it's, intermittent reinforcement is extremely powerful. And so whether it's rats in a maze that you only reward them periodically, they're going to run that maze a lot of times to get that reward. And that's the way it is with that type of conditioning. If you're only going to reward intermittently, the person never knows when the thrill is going to come of winning. And they'll come back over and over and over to get it, as we have seen that people have thrown their whole life away for the next toss of the dice or the next spin of the roulette wheel or whatever it is, because the next one could be the one that they win with. And so they keep themselves coming back and back. And so that's why gambling can be so compulsive. Okay, so the operant is very good if you're used it in a proper way. And of course it can be a big problem if it's not used in a proper way as far as a bad behavior. Along the way, another type of therapy has developed, and it's a very good therapy. It's called cognitive therapy. Now, cognitive therapy has to do with how you perceive something. So in cognitive therapy, you look at the behavior that someone has, and you make them aware of what they're thinking about it. And so the whole idea is to have them make a decision to think differently about something. And it works very well. Cognitive is a type of behavior therapy, in a sense. In fact, one of my certifications, national certifications, is a certified cognitive behavior therapist. And that means that you give them a new way of looking at it. Now, one of the offshoots of cognitive therapy, which is very powerful, which is something you can do for yourself, it could be done with a therapist, but you could do it for yourself, is neurolinguistic programming. Now, neurolinguistic programming, there's many books on it. The first two big ones that came out way at the beginning were called The Structure of Magic by two therapists by the name of Bandler and Grinder. And they neither one were really psychotherapists per se, but one was into linguistics and one was into neurology and so forth. And so the NLP means neurolinguistic programming, which was that they studied and got a good in-depth understanding of the effect of linguistics or words on neurology. And from that they developed some toolboxes of things that could rapidly cause you to reprogram or reframe things so that you could take a problem and you could diminish it and reframe it in a new behavior and make big changes. And so it worked extremely well. And as I say, the first two books, if you want to look at it, the basics of it is called The Structure of Magic by Bandler and Grender. And then a lot of people got involved with it, and many more books were written over time in the whole field of NLP. Generally, you can find a book that just, like a recent type book, that kind of brings you up to date on the basic principles of NLP, but it has a lot to do with language and how language affects the way your neurology works. And it's been very successful. Now, I don't know how many have heard of Tony Robbins or Anthony Robbins. He became pretty much an expert in NLP, but he didn't want to call what he was doing NLP, so he kind of rephrased it a little bit and called it a different name, cognitive associative conditioning, or something to that effect, instead of neurolinguistic programming. But it basically was the same thing. It was a cognitive type behavior or therapy where you could make yourself become more successful by getting rid of some of the problems that were holding you back. And so it had a lot of implications in terms of raising your level of performance, but your ability to be a winner, meaning to go out and succeed at whatever you wanted to do. So I think he's actually called it neuroassociative conditioning. I was just thinking what he actually ended up calling it. But it was basically neurolinguistic programming, and it has application in all kinds of things in your life and of dealing with other people and so forth. So it's a very good form of cognitive therapy, but one you could do for yourself. They have training programs to teach you how to do it, but in the process of doing that, you end up improving yourself. And they have two different levels of it, the practitioner level and the master level, and then they have also training, becoming teachers of it, so you can get certified in that. Sometimes it can get quite expensive if you want to go through the whole package, but if you just want to learn it, you could take the basic program, or actually you can learn it from a book if you wanted to put the time into it. And there's tapes available. There's tapes available you can get. In fact, there's a lot of stuff on the internet now that you can get the tapes, and most of the stuff I'm telling you are going to be things that you could do for yourself if you want to, and make a big change on your own. You don't have to pay a therapist. A lot of the stuff, unless you're really, really screwed up and you're having problems with dealing with life to the point that you are withdrawn or into a trance state of some sort where you're not connecting at all. But if they're just things that bug you, then yeah, you can do a lot with that. Out of a lot of this came something called Gestalt therapy too. I mentioned earlier about the work of Wilhelm Reich and his whole concept of the relation to the mind and body. Before we get to that, I just remembered I had brought a couple of books, but when we're talking about these two kind of go together, the Gestalt and what I were just telling you about NLP in a sense. But there's a very good book out called Your Body Believes Every Word You Say, and it says the language of the body-mind connection. Now, the reason I believe this is really good is because with NLP, which is the relationship between words and neurology, and ultimately when you're affecting neurology, you're going to affect the body. And so it all kind of ties together, because the work of Wilhelm Reich talked about the fact that your body becomes involved in your neuroses or your problems to the point that there's bands of armor around the body and that you need to break those. And so anyhow, the Gestalt dealt with his idea of the mind-body relationship and with something called Gestalt psychology, which is a term out of German. And we won't go into it in great detail because you can read about it. And one of the big developers of the whole concept of Gestalt therapy was a guy by the name of Friedrich Perls, or Fritz Perls for short. And he wrote a book on called Gestalt Therapy Verbatim, and he also wrote one on his own life called In and Out of the Garbage Pail. So they're interesting books to read, but Gestalt has to do with your perception of stressors and your ability to lay a stressor to rest or to resolve it so that you can keep your mind, emotions, and so forth in free flow. But if something is a problem and it becomes a stressor that you either don't want to deal with and you keep holding back, then it becomes a problem in your life and it begins to inhibit your freedom to act as a whole person, meaning that you've now got this crutch, so to speak, or this limp, and you can't get rid of the limp because it's in your psyche and it's being held back. And so it is important to know that there is this relationship heavily between mind, body, and you can't separate the two. And it's very important that you understand that. Now, there's a lot more books that have come out on it. I had picked up one some time back called The Body Bears the Burden, Trauma, Dissociation, and Disease. And it's a very interesting looking book, but what's in it's even more interesting. And so this doctor gets heavily into the whole idea of how the body-mind works. Now, there's a pile of books out there on that. Dr. Levine has done a tremendous amount of research in problems in the body, how they are related to emotions. But anyhow, Gestalt became a way of connecting with all of that. And so Dr. Perls connected Gestalt there, this whole idea of Gestalt psychology, with the work of Wilhelm Reich of the body, and so he developed a form of therapy that helped you become aware of the body connections and basically break some of those patterns that you have within yourself that are big problems. Now, out of that work, there was a big student of Freud by the name of Alexander Lowen. And so he didn't like the term that Reich came up with, which was orgone therapy. And orgone was a word that Reich had created. It meant organic energy. And so he said that there's energy to emotions and that energy can get blocked and locked up in certain parts of the body, and you have to break that loose. So Lowen renamed it bioenergetic therapy just because it was energy of biology, and so it was a more palatable term, and so he developed it further. There was another doctor by the name of Ellsworth Baker in New York, and I'm not sure if he works anymore, but he wrote a book called Man in the Trap, and he still called it orgone therapy. But anyhow, it gave you this idea of this mind-body relationship, and Reich realized that if you had these blockages for a long time, they could lead to physical pathology, meaning the body could develop a cancer, it could develop some type of a chronic illness because of the constriction of the free movement of energy. And so Reich's goal was to free up the energy so we're free to function as a whole person, not in some way blocked or infirmed so that we can't walk properly. So it became a very good a method of becoming aware, number one, and number two, freeing it up. So now these books by Alexander Lowen are out there. You can find them. In fact, one of his basic books is called Bioenergetic Therapy. And so it gives you the basics, and then he has other books out, so any of the books related to him, it was important. And then you have, to me, what's important is there is a homeopathic approach to the therapies, because I know that a lot of the problems we have emotionally can come in with us as epigenetic influences, and the first person to deal with those was Dr. Hahnemann many years ago, under what he called the topic of miasms, which are inherited taints that we bring in, and those predispose us to certain ways of thinking and emotional issues. And so Dr. Hahnemann discovered that there's certain homeopathic remedies that will help clear those out. The regular science and medicine in current research has become aware of this. They gave it a new name, epigenetics, which means something that we bring in from past generations, but it's not part of the gene. So it's information that we carry from one generation to the next that can affect us behaviorally, emotionally, as well as physically, because the epigenetics tend to affect the way the genes express. So that was important information to have, to know that it's sometimes our problems weren't all of our own creation, but has a link to some of the past generations. And so it became a good way. Now, epigenetics, they haven't done so much within regular medicine except to understand the process, but not to figure out how to correct it. I'm saying homeopathic medicine in my mind, using the right homeopathics, what are called constitutional miasmic remedies. And if you study the Materia Medica and the Organon and the Repertory and so forth, you will see that certain remedies are referred to as miasmic in nature, either syphilitic miasmic, phthoric miasmic, or gonorrheal, which they called psychotic, S-Y-C-O-T-I-C. And each of those kind of predispose us to certain types of emotional states. Now, there was a mixture of some of the old ones, and there was something called pseudosorrow, which was a mixture of sorrow and syphilis. And then there's one that seemed to grow out of all this called the tubercular miasm, and that predisposes a lot of restlessness, inability to stay in one place, feeling a compulsion to move, and so forth. So each one of these had their own effect, and each of them have remedies that tend to eradicate those. And I've seen almost like overnight changes in people when we hit that deep miasmic remedy. It's almost like, wow, the person is totally changed. I've seen between two sessions of coming in my office, the person being distressed, depressed, looking unkept. I mean, talking about a lady who just, her hair was unkept, her dress was kind of so-so. Actually, not so-so, not pretty bad. And give her one single remedy and come back the next time with their hair done, makeup on, almost looks like a new outfit of clothes, like a total change just between two sessions by taking the right miasmic remedy. So, I mean, I've seen all that happen, so I know it can happen, and I've seen it more than once happen, so I know it can. So anyhow, that to me is something that can be done, that you don't have to take drugs, and a therapist, the right therapist, and there are a few psychiatrists who know homeopathy, and utilize it, especially those who are Jungian therapists, I would say. There's some of those that have gotten into homeopathy, into the archetypes and so forth. And so you could get a good therapy that really gets people well without trying to burn up the brain with all the psychoactive drugs that are being used today. Now, there's some unusual approaches for very particular things, because I think you recall by now, maybe I've thrown you a lot of stuff, so maybe not, that Clancy McKenzie, a psychiatrist, came up with something called delayed post-traumatic stress disorder, which means that some occurrence that happened in the first 3 years of life has become traumatic to you, caused a locking of the freedom of thought and emotions and so forth, and that over the years more things happen that reinforce it till finally it comes to a point that it's too much, and so the person could have a major breakdown, become manic depressive, could become schizophrenic or whatever. And so that's called post-traumatic stress disorder or disease or disturbance related to some particular event or the perception of an event. It's not necessarily an event, because two people can both experience an event. One person can shake it and go on. The other person will be permanently disabled, which is really the same thing as war neuroses. Some events can be so shocking, and I knew a case like that, that this guy had seen something happen in World War II. And when he came back, he was pretty much non-functional until he was able to talk the whole thing out. What had happened is they had crossed a bridge, and the bridge had been booby-trapped, and it exploded before all the men got off the bridge. They were so badly mangled that they were ordered, these soldiers were ordered to shoot them rather than to leave them in such a terrible shape. And that bore on him for years until he finally was able to release out the emotions related to that, and it changed his whole behavior and everything, because now that would be in the case of a post-traumatic stress problem. And so, anyhow, there's been some progress in that, in the sense that a lady by the name of Francine Shapiro has written a book called EMDR. I don't know if you've heard of EMDR. It means eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which sounds quite complex. But the idea is that the brain, it's almost like that type of shock to the right person. It's like suddenly their brain freezes and they're stuck. And so then they turn on the gerbo wheel in the brain, the cingulate gyrus, that just keeps circling around. So the right stimulus turns it on and it plays out. So the person who's come out of war, they hear something like a gunshot or a backfire or anything, it acts as a stimulus, it turns on and plays out the same. They all of a sudden see all the old stuff from the original event, and they're stuck there. They can't get out of it. So this Francine Shapiro got the idea. Of course, the visual cortex is very powerful in the brain, and so she came up with a method of moving something back and forth in front of your eyes and having your eyes follow it. So that's the eye movement part of it. And if you keep doing that and you're bringing up this problem, it actually desensitizes it. And then you can help the person reintegrate and move on. And so that's why it's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So you learn how to reprocess things, and you break that whole pattern. And it's very powerful. Now, the organization of people who do that type of therapy, whenever there's a big event like 9/11 or out in Oklahoma City, the federal building, or any kind of major event, hurricane, tornado, I don't care what it is, they have a group of volunteers who will go in and immediately start working with these people with this EMDR and stop that from becoming a big post-traumatic problem. They help them free it up right then and get through it and move on. And they do that on a voluntary basis, which I think is quite admirable, because most of the people you think of in therapy anymore, it's a profession to make money, and they would be happy if you want to pay them to come and do it. But these people do it voluntarily, which I think, as I say, is a tremendous help. And there has been an offshoot of that just called rapid eye movement, which is very similar to that. Like I say, almost everything that comes along that seems to have value, there's some people copy it and try to develop their own approach to it and put their name to it instead of the original person. So I've looked at both of the materials, and it's very good. Gee, I only got through one page already. I don't know. How are we doing time-wise? We're about ready, getting close, huh? Wow. Let me take a peek here. Okay, we're just going to continue on with some more of these ideas. Now remember, some of the things I'm telling you, in fact most of the things I'm telling you now, are things you can do on your own. You don't have to go to a therapist for. Sometimes you might want, if it's something unusual, to go for maybe them applying what we're talking about. For example, if you want to do hypnotherapy, you can do self-hypnosis, and there's some books out there and recordings that would tell you how to do and train you. Actually, the recording can train you to do self-hypnosis. So a lot you could do for yourself, but you might want to go to a professional hypnotherapist and maybe have a session or two, and maybe not. You may be able to do it on your own, so I'm not saying you have to, but primarily most of the things I've been telling you about are things that you could do on your own. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about one of my favorites that I learned many years ago. And this is based on the analytical model in a sense. Many years ago, a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Eric Byrne was in a session with an attorney who was a patient. And they're going along, and suddenly the attorney makes a comment. And then after he makes the comment, he immediately said, "That's my child speaking." And in Eric Byrne's mind, something clicked. Oh. And then he got to thinking, well, yeah, I guess, we do kind of shift back and forth between ego states, and sometimes we might behave as a child, and sometimes we might behave as an adult, and sometimes we might behave as a parent. And so he got to looking into it more and more, and out of that he developed something called transactional analysis. Now, I learned it, as I said, many years ago, and I went into it in depth. I used it for patients, along with some Gestalt therapy approaches, getting into feelings. Now, we didn't really get that heavy into the Gestalt, talking about the feeling side, but basically, Gestalt is an extremely good therapy for people who have blocked emotions. People who have too much emotional outgoing responses to things, their emotions tend to be out of control. Now, I'll throw this in real fast because the two of these kind of melt together pretty good. But years ago when I studied with Dr. Irvin Rosing, I mentioned probably that he said that he used something called definitive therapy, which means you define where the patient is, you adapt the therapy to the patient. But he said in general he noticed that people tended to fall into one of two general classes, either schizoid or they are over-emotional, they're moody. So he looked at them as either schizoid or moody. Now, schizoid meant that they either consciously or unconsciously were suppressing or repressing feelings. So therefore they weren't feeling or expressing outward much emotion, and sometimes none. On the other hand, the moody person was emoting all over the place, so to speak. And so he felt you had to adapt your therapy to which type they were. Now, when I'm saying Gestalt therapy, I'm thinking of utilizing it when somebody appears to be having their emotions blocked. And so to me, it tended to work well with transactional analysis for people who were not experiencing their feelings. They were blocking them or holding them back, either consciously or unconsciously. And so Gestalt became a good approach to do that. So at any rate, Eric Byrne found that when people are young, of course they're a child, and as they grow up they're supposed to be an adult, and then when they have a family they tend to parent. Now those are the three basic ego states. But what he did is he kind of correlated it to Freud's idea of the id being the child state, and the adult being the regular ego state, and the super ego being the parent state. So within these three states, we tend to move back and forth if we're kind of free to move around like we should be able to emotionally. Then there are times when we come out of our parent state, there are times when we come out of our adult state, and times when we come out of our child state. So there is that real physical child, adult, and parent states, and then there's the emotional states that go with those. So we can tell many times, and probably most times, which state you are coming from by the way in which you say certain things. For example, if someone says to you, "You should never do that," what state do you think they would be coming from? They would be coming from the parent state, of course. And, of course, the parent state was divided into the nurturing parent and the critical parent. So when they say, "You never do that," that's going to be, of course, the critical parent. So you can tell by behaviors as far as where the person is. On the other hand, if somebody says, "Hey, let's go play some tennis, or let's go play some golf, and we're going to have a lot of fun." Now, what do you think they're going to be coming out of? Yeah, it's pretty easy to say, yeah, they're coming out of the child state. And if somebody says, okay, as Sergeant Friday used to say on Dragnet, all we want are the facts, ma'am, just give us the facts. Now, what state do you think they're coming out of? Of course, they're going to be coming out of the adult ego state. No emotion, no feeling, we just want the facts. And so, yeah, you can begin to tell after a while where someone is at any given time. Now, sometimes people get stuck in those states. When you get somebody who is always criticizing everyone and talking about they must and they shouldn't and they should and never and always and those kind of terms, you know that that person's probably stuck in their parent ego state. Or the one that wants to nurture everybody. You know, they could be coming out of the nurturing parent state. And if the ones who always going to be on the run, always want to play, always want to have fun, and working is a real drag because it's interrupting our fun and games and having a good time, let's all go to the ball game, let's all go to the beach, let's all do this, those people can be stuck in their child ego state. And the person that never has any fun in anything and never has anything to say except just give me the data, give me the facts, blah, 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 then they could be stuck in an ego state. You know, the accountant who sits off in the corner and does nothing but work with figures, doesn't want to interact with other people. He just needs to get these figures done in balance. Or the programmer that's programming a computer. These people can be very stuck in their adult ego state. Now, the whole idea is that if you take a person with these three ego states and they come up to another person with these three ego states, something happens. And that happening is called a transaction. And that's how it got its name, transactional analysis, which is how do two or more sets of ego states come together and interact or transact. And so if you come up to somebody and you say to that person, what time is it? And that person says to you, by looking at their watch, well, it's 3 o'clock. Okay, that's just a factual transaction. So what would that be? That would be an adult asking for a piece of information and another adult returning that piece of information. And so that's complementary. That's a complementary transaction. Now suppose that you go up to the person and you say, what time is it? And they come back to you and say, why aren't you responsible enough to have your own watch? Now what do you think would be happening? You ask from your adult ego state to their adult ego state for a piece of information, but what did they do? They came across that from their parent state and criticized you because you weren't responsible enough to have your own watch. So that's called a cross transaction. So the first one was very complementary. It went from your adult to their adult, and they responded from their adult back to your adult. That's complementary. But when you come from your adult and they come back from their parent, that's called a cross transaction. That doesn't work very well. You got a choice of either ignoring it and moving on or getting into a hassle. And then you both can drop into your child ego state and fight like crazy. So on the other hand, if you said to the person, what time is it? And they said, well, Mickey's big hand is on 3, and the little hand is on blah, blah, blah. You could guess they were probably coming out from their child ego state and wanted to kind of play a little bit. Which still could be a cross-transaction, but with a whole lot less emotion than if someone kicked you in the butt for asking what time it is. So anyhow, it's that whole interaction of transactions between people from their parent, adult, and child ego states that constitute the basics of transactional analysis. But there's a whole lot more to it than that. We're not going to have time to talk about all of it. But just to make you aware that there is such a thing as transactional analysis, and there's a lot of good books. Now, Eric Berne put out a book about the whole basic discovery and developing of the system, and the book, of course, is called Transactional Analysis. He later put out one called Games People Play. Now, Games People Play had to do with the way that these transactions take place, because we talked about complementary transactions, and we talked about cross transactions. There's a third action that's called an ulterior transaction, We don't have a whole lot of time to get into that, but that's where all the interesting things are, because out of the ulterior transactions we get into what are called games. And games have to do with seeming to say something on one level, but really meaning something on a different level. And they are quite humorous because he gave the games interesting names, like one of my favorites, of course, is one called Niggy Sob. And Niggy Sob are the initials for Now I've Got You, USOB. And that means that you use an ulterior transaction to set the person up, and when this person responds to the setup, then you give them the big kick. Because they were wearing a tag that says, "Please don't kick me," which means I'm open to be kicked. And so the games, as I say, they have all kinds of interesting titles. Corner, which means you get put in the corner and either way you go you're wrong. Games like Rapo, like I'm setting you up to make a pass at me, and once you do, then I give you a kick for doing it. And all kinds of things that are in those ulterior transactions, which is where all the interesting things go on. So I think you would enjoy reading Games People Play, because you're going to say, "Oh yeah, I know that one." Things like Wooden Leg, and because don't expect anything much from me. After all, I have a wooden leg. So when I flop, it was because I had the wooden leg. I couldn't help it. So there's a pile of them that that are interesting and enjoyable to read. And as I say, you're going to find all these cases where you say, "Oh yeah, I dealt with somebody like that." I guess one of my real interesting ones, besides Niggy Sob, was the one is, "Gee, you're wonderful professor. You're uncommonly perceptive, Mrs. Murgatroyd." Now that one I thought is very interesting. But when you read Burns' book of Games People Play, you would find it interesting. Now, years ago when they first came out, people thought they were kind of quaint and humorous and so forth, but a lot of people never caught the real implication of what they were all about. Now, out of all of this, what happens in a real nutshell is that as a very small child, getting back to those first 3 years that Mackenzie talked about, and my teacher that I learned with, Dr. Irving Rosen, about those first 3 years is where the early psychological things are going on, and the psychological birth is taking place at about age 3, and how that's handled with the mother becomes extremely important many times for the rest of your life. So if you believe that your mother is not going to love you if you don't do something other than be you, which means that at some point the mother gives you the impression that you're not lovable as you are. Now that's called an injunction. If you're not lovable as you are, then something's wrong with you. Not your mother, something's wrong with you. If she can't love you as you are, something's wrong with you. That's what your perception is. So that becomes an injunction that it's not okay to be you. So if you cannot be you, then what can you be? So you have to take on a different personality to try to please the mother so you won't be cut off from her affections. And so the love becomes, in this case, a wedge to keep you from being you. And so since you have to be somebody other than you, you begin to take on a different personality. You begin to choose certain people, certain costumes, and a certain script for your life, and you write yourself a script, and it's called a life script. And so Dr. Rudolf Steiner wrote a book called Scripts People Live. And so scripts have a certain way of being carried out, and it's a way of not being you, because it's not okay to be you. And so that's where the okayness comes in, because when you decide that it's not okay to be you, then Thomas Harris wrote a book called I'm Okay, You're Okay. And it has to do with how you perceive yourself and other people. So if the mother gives you this injunction, you think, I'm not okay. She's okay. And therefore other people seem to be okay, but there's something wrong with me. And so that becomes your theme, and so your script is written according to that theme. There's 4 okayness positions, generally. We won't get into some other sophisticated stuff. But generally, there's 4 okay positions. I'm okay, you're okay is the healthiest. Meaning, I may not be perfect, but I'm okay the way I am. And you may not be perfect, but you're okay the way you are. And that's the healthy position, because then you're not locked into something. But most people, to a degree, assume I'm not okay, but everybody else seems to be okay. And so that's the introspective position. You're always wondering what's wrong with you when everybody else seems to make it fine. The third position is that I'm okay, but you're not okay. And that, of course, is called the projective, when you project out your problems and think the whole world is wrong except you. Those are the people who can become basically sociopaths. Everybody else in the world is screwed up, so no one else can do anything for them. And if they have problems because of their behavior, it's the world's fault, not theirs. And if they commit a crime and they get arrested and go to prison, they're in prison not because they committed a crime, but because of all those other people out there that are not okay. If it weren't for them, I wouldn't be there. And so they don't take responsibility. So they project off their problem. And of course, the third position is that I'm not okay, you're not okay. And that's the futility position. And that means not only am I screwed up, but everyone else is too, so it's all hopeless. Those many times tend to be the people that put into their script suicide, which means it's the only way out of all this mess is just to check out. And so it's pretty powerful stuff. I mean, it's humorous in some respects, but when you really get into it, it's pretty powerful. And so there's good books out there to help people utilize these principles to help clear up a lot of their garbage. Now, again, all this is assuming that you're still reasonably functional. If you're not, then you may have to go to somebody else. But TA has been used in groups, and it has been used individually, and it's been used as self-help. And a couple of very good writers, 2 ladies by the name of Muriel James and Joanne Youngward, wrote a good book called Born to Win. And Born to Win does not only just teach you these principles in a very abbreviated way, meaning you don't have to get into it in great depth, but they have exercises in the book you can do to help you connect to some of these things, like, did you have an injunction, and what was the theme of the injunction? If you wrote a script, what was the theme of your script? How's your okayness factor? Well, are you okay or you're not okay? And so forth, and gets into all of this. And so it's a very good book to read. It seems to me they have one specially just for women too, called Women as Winners. But the first one is generally for everyone, and everyone is born to win. They may not decide that because of things that happen, such as with mother and their conditions as a very early child. But I think it's very good material. You'll find it easy to relate to, because instead of having all the jargon that you have in psychoanalysis, which most people don't relate to, with this, it's a common everyday terms. I mean, we can relate to the term parent, adult, and child. We can relate to these games because they have interesting, funny titles, and so forth. And we can relate to the life scripts, because then you can seriously sit down and begin to figure out your life script. So if you get any of the books by Eric Byrne, they're going to be good. Thomas Harris, as I said, on the okayness factor, he kind of concentrates on that. Steiner concentrates on the script idea, and so forth. So from those you can put all the pieces together, and it's interesting and very good self-therapy that you can do and make a lot of progress with it. Now, there's associations of transactional analysis, and there are therapists who use it as their tool, but you can do a lot with it under self-help, and especially if you applied some Gestalt, if you had your feelings all blocked up, it could work very well. So I mentioned the Gestalt idea and the bioenergetics and so forth. The bioenergetics by itself, apart from Gestalt therapy, because Fritz Perls had some specific techniques that helped uncover. He had something about the empty chair deal where you could sit in a chair and you're on the other side, and you could analyze dreams with it, and you would talk to parts of your dream back and forth, what your dream trying to tell you. He had the death scene where somebody that had died and you had unresolved issues with them. In Gestalt, they would say that you've never buried the person yet. You have all this unresolved stuff, so you imagine yourself looking at the person in the coffin and telling them or asking them questions or telling them that you forgive them and so forth, and laying to rest unresolved junk that you have about the other person. So these are all out of Fritz Perls in the Gestalt. But bioenergetics is freeing up the energy in the body and breaking these bands of armoring that collect around the body that become a part of your neuroses. It's locked in, and so Lowen starts out by breathing, because that's one of the first things you need to do, is to start getting air in and getting energy in if you're going to break in any of these bands. And so he starts you doing some basic breathing exercises that require you to open the throat and to use the diaphragm to breathe with, and start bringing lots of air in, which brings lots of energy in and lots of oxygen, and it can start helping you to energize your body and therefore to break some of this stuff. Now, when you are very young, and you start to cry and your parents say, "Stop it," how do you do it? You have to tighten your throat and you have to control your breathing to keep from crying or sobbing. And so that can become chronic, and in order to do that, you had to tighten certain muscles, and over time, those muscles become chronically locked, and therefore they impair the free movement of energy in your body and can be a big problem. So that's something you can do with some of Lowen's books, and an associate of his name was Dr. Pirakis, who was a Greek physician, and Stanley Kellerman, who was a clinical psychologist out of California. He got heavily involved, and he wrote a book called The Body Speaks Its Own Mind. So if you really want to do some self-help with some of those things, those are pretty good ones to go with. And it would depend. See, that's very good for people who have a lot of blocked emotions. Kind of like Gestalt, you're wanting to get in and free up those emotions so that the person can have the emotional states freely moving and not being rigid or locked into a certain thing or area. And that's the whole thing about, quote, pathology is that it's the lack of freedom. So it's interesting because in true psychotherapy, the whole concept is that you're free. You're free to think and feel, and you're not locked up in some way. And in homeopathic medicine, the definition of health is freedom. It's freedom to act in whatever way you choose, not because something else is blocking or inhibiting the way you function and the way you move. So we can take it a step further, and there is another form of therapy which is extremely good. Now, you remember that I mentioned about Dr. Roger Callahan and what became known as energy psychology was that he discovered that by tapping on certain acupoints and certain sequences would free up people's phobias and so forth. And as I say, he could have someone who has a morbid fear of spiders. In fact, they filmed him doing that. He originally called it the 5-minute phobia cure because usually in 5 minutes he could break a phobia by the person thinking about it and tapping on these acupoints on the energy systems that we talked about earlier that move through the whole body. And we talked about the fact that the different organs are related to different energies and different emotions. And so anyhow, he had this lady who had a morbid fear of spiders. If she even saw a photo of a spider, she developed tremendous fear and anxiety. And so he did the tapping, had her think about the spider, and then he brings out a live tarantula about this big and sets it on her hand. And she stands there holding it and petting it with no problem. Took 5 minutes to get rid of it. So this energy tapping actually is very good. But now, of course, he developed it not to do yourself, but to go to a therapist who's trained in his approach, which is called thought field therapy, and get relief from problems very rapidly. Well, there was an engineer from, I believe, I'm trying to think which university, but anyhow, for some reason I'm thinking it's Yale, but I could be wrong. Anyhow, his name was Gary Craig. And so he went to one of the training programs with Roger Callahan, and when he came back, he says, Dr. Callahan's making this too complex. And he said, I think we can fix that. We can make it so anybody can do their own therapy with it. And so that's what he did. He developed something called emotional release therapy, or ERT. And he has put out a manual on it, which is free, that you can get off the internet, that goes through the whole process, goes into depth explaining how it works and why it works, and how you can take care of your own problems with it. And there's been a small book published, again, this is from Gary Craig, called EFT, the EFT Manual. Now this goes into a more abbreviated approach to it, but it's helpful. If you have both this one, which I think is about $15, and you have the one that is free, which is 100 and some pages, 8.5 by 11 pages, you've got a system that's pretty inexpensive. Now, he also has made some videos, and I think they're still available, very inexpensively, because he didn't go into it to make money. He retired, actually, as an engineer, and he just became fascinated with the idea that people could help themselves by doing this tapping and thinking of these issues while they tap and make big change in their life. So it's a very good self-help approach, and as I say, it's now been classified, both thought field therapy and emotional release technique, or emotional release. Anyhow, it's traveled around the world. People are doing it everywhere. Actually, he called it emotional freedom. I'm saying emotional release because there's another one called release. Emotional freedom technique. And it's very simple. Instead of, Callahan tried to make it different for each person, and tried to do a kinesiology and a whole lot of things and made it much more complex. But Craig seemed to get about the same effect just by teaching people a very basic routine you do for whatever the problem is. And it seemed to work very well. So if you want something inexpensive that can be very beneficial, and a lot of people have gotten rid of all kinds of problems, and now the applications of it are tremendous. There's a guy by the name of Dr. Gallo that put out a book called The Promise of Energy Psychology, which gets into a discussion of how effective these techniques are. And so that book is available also, and you're going to see some others out there now on energy psychology, as it's kind of a growing field. So that's a very good one for you to get in for your own self. And as I say, it's very inexpensive because this is $15. The one on the internet is free. And if you can find the videos, they're very inexpensive too. They were pretty much all just at cost because he was just wanting to help people. Well, as I look at what I have left, and knowing that I want to do at least a decent job of presenting this information, it looks to me like, contrary to what I was wanting, we're going to have another session. My producer's laughing at me. She says, he's a big mouth, he never shuts up. I was born under the sign of the big mouth. Anyhow, we have enough good material that I hate for you not to get it and really get a chance to look at it. I brought some toys today. I'll just show you real fast. These are called light sound machines. That's part of the stuff we want to talk about. There's another one called ICAP, which has to do with measuring the right prefrontal lobes to show that you've gotten rid of negative emotions, and some other nice things. But unfortunately, we're not going to have a time to do them justice. Excuse me. So, I guess the next time we will finish this session with some very, very interesting material. In fact, I had saved the most interesting to me to last. So just be coming back next week again for our broadcast from the mindyourhealthcast.com. We want you to go there, look through everything, and if you want to look at our clinical site, you can click from there. And if you want to go to the broadcast, you can go directly from there, or if you want to go directly to the broadcast, remember it's freedocast.com/mindyourhealthcast. and that will take you directly to our show. We may be changing something about it. I'm just working up some ideas what we might do down the road, but of course we're going to continue the broadcast. It's just we may change more and get into some interviews and some product reviews and some book reviews and so forth. I just have made this first several months very, very educational. My feedback that I've been getting is that the people enjoy it. One of the pharmacists that watches it every week said he's always disappointed when the end comes for each broadcast because he was anxious for more. So at any rate, we're going to, we may do some changes, but we're probably going to come to an end of the highly informative and go more into current issues, a lot of different things. So these will all be available on DVD, so you can actually get a basic education about the whole health field as we've been covering, and I'll make sure that before we finish this, we'll have covered pretty much everything in a general way. And then we're going to have some programs available you can get to study at home, whether if you're a therapist or a doctor or whatever, or for your own purposes. We will actually have some modular study programs that you can get the DVDs and the books and the written material at home, and you can learn this in more depth. Maybe it's too much depth for you already, I don't know, but it depends on the person. But for therapists, though, that want seriously, we're going to have the program available in modules. So until the next time, be healthy.